What does liberty sound like? How can political allegiance and the ideals of a political movement be expressed through music? I'm Emily Chambers, and in this series we'll explore an exhibition about Beethoven at the British Library, which took place between December 2021 and April 2022. The exhibition reflects the socio-cultural context of life in Bonn, where Beethoven was born and spent his formative years, and Vienna, where he moved to when he was 21 years old. This context represents a period of significant change in both the music business and of the political landscape of Europe. Beethoven lived at the time of the French Revolution, and his political views were shaped by the ideals of the revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity, a phrase popularised by Robespierre, one of the most influential figures of the revolution. Such progressive views were not shared by all monarchs or governments across Europe, and as such, Beethoven had to be mindful as to whom he expressed these political ideals and how these were expressed. Music was one way in which he was able to express such views with greater nuance, and throughout his works we can find evidence of Beethoven's political ideology expressed in different ways. Beethoven's revolutionary views were influenced by his childhood in Bonn, governed by Archbishop-Elector Maximilian Franz, brother of Marie Antoinette and son of the Holy Roman Emperor. Maximilian Franz ruled according to the ideals of the Enlightenment, an intellectual and philosophical movement which celebrated liberty, progress, and the pursuit of knowledge through reason. Working as a court musician was the family business, and Beethoven followed his father and grandfather into the court of Maximilian Franz at the age of 11. It's here that we find our first example of the influence of politics and political alignment in Beethoven's music. This is reflected in the people to whom Beethoven dedicated his compositions throughout his life. Beethoven's first published piano sonatas, composed when he was just 12 years old and published in 1783, were dedicated to the ruling Elector of Cologne. The book exhibited included numerous annotations of the score by Beethoven himself. Beethoven also used political figures as the subject of his compositions, which forms our second example of political influence. The cantata for the coronation of Leopold II in 1790, alongside its companion, the cantata on the death of the Emperor Joseph II, was commissioned by the Reading Society of the University in Bonn, founded by Maximilian Franz. Completed when Beethoven was 20 years old, but never performed in his lifetime, the cantatas celebrate political figures whose views reflected the values of the Enlightenment. The exhibition displays a page from Beethoven's sketchbooks, showing fragments of musical ideas and half-developed melodies. Sketchbooks such as these are valuable to musicologists in understanding Beethoven's thought process as he composed his works and the development of his musical ideas. Within the context of an exhibition, these give a fascinating insight into the creative mind of an artist. The complexity of Beethoven's political ideology is also reflected within his compositions, which forms our third example of revolutionary politics in Beethoven's works. This is evident through the texts he chose to set to music and programmatic or non-musical ideas, stories, which underpin the music. Notably featured in the exhibition are texts by Friedrich Schiller, a German playwright, poet, historian and philosopher, a small number of whose texts Beethoven set to music. The exhibition label quotes Beethoven as saying, "Schiller's poems are extremely difficult to set to music. The composer must raise himself far above the poet, but who can do that in Schiller's case?" Reflecting Beethoven's political interest in liberty, universal and humanistic interests is his three-voice canon setting Schiller's words, "Pain is brief, joy is forever." A first edition copy of Schiller's Ode to Joy, published in 1786, is featured, with the highlight of the exhibition being a manuscript of the first full score of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony with its climatic setting of Ode to Joy. The exhibition label notes, this manuscript became the first musical score to be added to UNESCO's Memory of the World Register in 2001. In terms of programmatic or non-musical ideas or stories reflected in the musical action, Beethoven incorporates several scenes from war in his compositions, reflecting his political views. In Wellington's Siege, composed in 1813, Beethoven expresses loyalty to the imperial family in Vienna, Austria being a declared enemy of the new French Republic. Celebrating a British victory over the French reflects Beethoven's political ambiguity, a supporter of the ideals of the French Revolution, yet famously removing a dedication to Napoleon in his Third Symphony. The changing political relationship between Austria and France at the time Wellington's Siege was written, and Beethoven's loyalty to the benevolent aristocratic rule of his youth demonstrate the complex political landscape and changing times in which Beethoven lived. Wellington's Siege is dedicated to the Prince Regent, who later became King George IV, and the work was first performed at a concert benefiting wounded Austrian and Bavarian soldiers. Incorporating instruments of a military band, the music quotes from God Save the King and Rule Britannia, representing the British, and the French folk song Marlborough Has Left for the War, better known as For He's a Jolly Good Fellow, representing the French. The music is programmatic in the sense that it represents the two armies on their approach to the battleground and the subsequent battle. The French national anthem is notably absent from the work, perhaps since this was considered treasonous in Vienna at the time. Yet Enlightenment thinking and ideology which underpinned the French Revolution is reflected in another work, The Drum Rolls, composed for the Viennese premiere of Goethe's play Egmont in 1810. This work tells the story of a political prisoner from the perspective of his military sweetheart, imagining joining her lover by dressing as a soldier. A year earlier, Vienna had succumbed to Napoleon's army after a 4-day siege in which Beethoven reportedly sheltered in the cellar of his brother's house. However, just as the French Revolution and political landscape in Europe impacted upon Beethoven's compositions, Beethoven's music also impacted upon political events, bringing us to our final example. During the diplomatic conference, the Congress of Vienna, in 1814 to 1815, Beethoven's music featured heavily in the concerts supporting the event, including a specially composed cantata, The Glorious Moment. These examples reveal the complex political landscape of revolutionary Europe at the time in which Beethoven lived, and how Beethoven negotiated and reflected different political viewpoints in his music. Despite this complexity, one message is constant throughout Beethoven's work: his desire for the liberation of humanity and the ideals of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel and click the bell to be notified of future videos in this series.